All right, guys. So I don't even have my cool Devslopes background up. We are diving straight into code because I want to get, flying projectiles here. All right, so we have the hardest part of our code done. We're finding the nearest enemy. If you guys remember last video, we created a list that registered all of our enemies to one public list. And then in our tower, we're getting the nearest enemies in range. And if they are in range, they get added to another list. And then we are comparing that. We take the closest distance inside of that list and return an enemy, right? All right. So, but now we need to put the code in that, creates a projectile object and, moves that object. We are going to move stuff. And so let's see. So our attack counter, if you remember, was the delay between shots fired, right? So we're going to say if this tower can't shoot faster than every 2 seconds. So we need to be able to adjust that somewhere, right? Basically what we're going to do is take attack counter and we're going to subtract delta time from it in the update field. And so once attack counter hits 0, it's going to allow the enemy to be targeted again. And then at the end of that attack counter is going to be set back to time between attacks. So until time between attacks turns into 0 again, it can attack again. Does that make sense? And time between attacks is what we're going to be setting in the inspector. So if we want it 2 seconds, once attack counter hits 0, it gets set back to 2 seconds. And we need 2 different variables for this because if we change time between attacks, we wouldn't know what to set it back to for the delay. So right away at the top, let's just go ahead and call attack counter and do minus equals, and then we need to call time dot delta time. And all that's going to do is every time update's called, it's going to call the difference in time. So it's not going to be a second, it's going to be whatever the frame rate is because update's called every frame. So some crazy small number is going to be subtracted from our attack counter every time update is called. All right, so we need to target an enemy so we know where to send our projectiles. So first check we need to do is if our target enemy, and that's our variable up here, is equal to null, well, we need to find a target enemy, right? So if our target enemy is equal to null, we need to see, first of all, if there's any enemies in range. And if there is, then we need to set the target enemy to the closest enemy, right? So let's do an if statement. And let's go ahead and call our get nearest enemy in range method that we created. And if that is not equal to null, and if our vector2.distance of our transform, so that's our tower's position, to our get nearest enemy in range, as long as this is less than or equal to our attack range, to our attack radius. Let me make this a little bigger so we can see. So if this is less than or equal to our attack radius, well, then we can do more stuff. Am I calling this wrong? I have too many parentheses or something. Oh, duh. This is returning an enemy object. I have to do dot transform dot position. Okay. Now we are error free, and that's the way to be. All right. So if our target enemy is equal to null, oh, and it's yelling at us because I forgot parentheses. Okay. So if our nearest enemy in range is not equal to null, that means it found something. It returns an enemy. And also, if that same enemy is within our attack radius, we can set our target enemy to get nearest enemy in range. Okay, cool. And I'm actually looking at this code, and I feel like we should probably only call this once and create a variable up here, like enemy nearest enemy equals get nearest enemy in range. Okay. And then if this is null, let's just paste nearest enemy here. Okay, if that is null, all right. And then also here, all right. And then target enemy would equal nearest enemy. That way we're only calling this once in this update. Otherwise we're calling it 3 times, and that's crazy. You shouldn't do that. Okay, so this finds us a target enemy. All right. I think we can move on from here at least. Let's see. Oh, right. Let's do another if statement. If our distance, so we need a vector2.distance. If our tower position to the distance of our target enemy, dot transform dot position. If this is greater than our attack radius, we have to, call off the attack. So our target enemy needs to go null. Okay. That way, so if an enemy made it outside of a target alive, that tower can no longer keep attacking him. And, this whole procedure will be run again then to find the next nearest enemy. Yeah. Okay, cool. So now we know now we have created a target for us to target. Now you're probably like, well, we need an attack method or something. Well, like, where are we creating this object? Like, we have to call an attack method, right? And so let's go ahead and make an attack method that we can call from our update. So public void attack. All right, I think that's a good name for it. Feel free to call it whatever you want. Okay, so now we need to create, so when attack is called, we need to create our projectile. So this is going to be, type projectile, and we can call this projectile. Or why don't we stick like, we had new enemy, target enemy. Why don't we say new projectile? All right, so that is that, and let's go ahead and instantiate this as a whole new object, and this is going to be a projectile, and that's our variable from up above. So I'm instantiating our private projectile variable, and we need to cast that as a projectile object. Cool. All right, so once we created our object, we need to, I guess we should probably check to see if our target enemy exists. If our target enemy doesn't, so if our target enemy is equal to null, well, we just created this projectile and we have to destroy it. So go ahead and say destroy projectile. Yeah. All right. So projectile was created. Destroy projectile. Destroy new projectile. All right. So if we created a projectile and there's no target enemy anymore, which is very possible. We could create a projectile and the enemy could be right on the skirt you know, the edge of our attack radius. And if that happens, we need to destroy the one that was just created to go after it. And if not, I can't type. So else, we want to move our projectile, right? So move projectile to enemy. And we're not going to do this here. So remember when we created our enemies in Game Manager and we spawned them with a coroutine. And basically this coroutine just kept calling itself until enemies spawned, until enemies list was less than total enemies. Until that failed, it would just keep calling itself, kind of like a recursive function. We want to do a similar thing with our projectile. We want to call a coroutine, and while the enemy is in range of our tower, the current projectile needs to go towards that enemy, right? So it always needs to recalculate and aim at that enemy and hit that enemy as long as that enemy is within range. Because once this projectile is created, it is only being fired at the target enemy that was the target at that moment. So you're not going to have like 3 arrows shot off and then they all change directions because your target enemy changed. So we need to call some sort of coroutine, and we're going to call it move projectile, or, you could call it, attack or launch projectile or kill enemy projectile. I don't know, whatever you want, I guess. All right. And we'll be passing in our new projectile object. And obviously it's yelling at us because I just created called a function that doesn't exist yet. And so you have to do the IE enumerator for a coroutine. And then we'll call this move projectile since I already named something that, or, called it up above. And this is going to take an object type, a game object of type projectile. Projectile. All right. And we'll go ahead and just call this projectile variable name. All right. So let's see. Do I have to? Oh, no, it's yelling at me because we're not returning anything yet. So that's okay. So let's see. Now we want this to loop until the projectile hits the enemy, right? So we should probably do like a while loop, and while this is true, we want to keep sending the projectile towards the target position, and the target position's constantly moving. So every time the while loop goes through, it'll kind of recalculate. And so let's go ahead and do while. And we need to, all right, let's see. We need to get the enemy in range. Okay, so, all right, so we have this whole list. We have like the nearest enemy and we have the target enemy, right? But we need to know exactly the distance between our tower and the target enemy when this is called. So if that target enemy moves or goes out of range, we're not replacing it with a new target enemy. So we're going to have to make a new function, and this is going to have to be called we're going to return a float with it. We're going to return the distance. So let's go ahead and call this a private float. It's going to return a float, and it's going to be called get target distance. And we're going to pass in an enemy type, and we'll call it just this enemy can be the local variable. That's fine. You can call it enemy, whatever you want. And we need to, if this enemy is equal to null, I had to finish this enemy. There we go. Is equal to null. Then we need to call get nearest enemy in range. And we already have that function, so we'll call get nearest enemy in range. Okay, so if it's null, it's still going to find an enemy for us, right? And I don't want to write this here. I meant to write this enemy. Okay, so if the enemy that we passed in from our move projectile is null, we're going to find a new enemy. So this enemy could still be null, right? So this could still return a null value. So we have to check it again. So if this enemy is equal to null, that means there are no enemies in range, right? So we need to return 0. And you have to just do the F because it's a float. But now, if all of these pass, so if it's not null, we can return the actual distance. So you can call math f dot absolute abs, and what that's going to do is if the distance happened to be negative or positive, it's always going to return a positive number for us. And then we can do the vector2 dot distance that you're familiar with, and we're going to pass in the tower transform dot position and compare it to this enemy dot transform dot position. Okay, and that's going to get returned. Okay, so what we're doing is we're finding the current target's distance, and that's very important in knowing if the enemy is even within range anymore, or if he exists. So we need to call get target distance in our while loop, and we're passing in target enemy. And that's a variable that we set up above in our update. So we already found our target enemy. And so that current target enemy, we need the distance. We need the distance to that. And we have to just make sure it's greater than 0.20 float. And that's kind of just I know it's kind of a random number, but that is just a number to, basically it's not really more accurate if you go lower than the 0.20 float. And so as long as it's above 0.2, it's not considered in the same exact spot as the tower, and we can shoot at them. And we also need to make sure the projectile is not null, because at any one of these points, it could have hit a target and destroyed itself. And we'll be setting it to when it makes contact destroy itself. So we always have to make sure it's not null. And we also have to make sure the target enemy is not null yet either, because the target enemy could die before this projectile gets to him, and then he's null. So if it passes all of these checks, it's going to do our while loop, okay? Okay, so we need to know a few things we need to know to move a game object. We need to know the direction that the arrow is going, or the projectile. We need to know the angle of the direction, so it's going the right way. And then we also need to know which way to make the object look. So like the point of the arrow aims at the enemy. And that is basically we're going to find the quaternion angle. And that is going to take care of the rotation of our object, so it doesn't just, like pretend this is your enemy right here. Your arrow wouldn't just hit him like this. It would fly into him straight. And that is what the quaternion angle is, okay? So we need to find a few things like that. And the direction is easy. Let's just create a variable called dir, short for direction. And we're going to take the target enemy dot transform dot position, and then just subtract the tower's position. All right, and that's the direction. And then we need to find the angle of the direction. So we'll call that angle direction. And to find that, we're just going to use a math function for tangent. Okay, and then we're going to put in direction y over direction x, and then convert it from radians to degrees, okay? All these are just built-in tools that are available for us. So this returns angle in radians, and it is the tangent, so it's y over x. All right, so we want to pass in direction.y and then direction.x, and that will find us the tangent in radians. And then let's go ahead and multiply this by math.f, and then we want radians to degrees, okay? And that is the angle of the direction that we need to send our projectile. Okay, so now that we have this information, we need to actually transform the position of our projectile object, okay? So go ahead, our projectile that we passed in is called projectile. So projectile.transform.rotation. So this is taking care of our looking, so our object, the quaternion angle. I think I'm saying that right. I don't know. I don't make any promises. Okay, so quaternion dot angle axis, and this creates the rotation, which so it's taking the degrees, and then we're going to use our angle direction that we found for the degrees, and it needs to be a float value if you see that right here. And that is what our angle direction is. And then we're going to send in, I know we've been using vector 2 and 2D stuff for everything, but for this exact scenario, we're going to use vector 3, and that's because they have this nice little thing that is called forward. And okay, so that takes care of the rotation of our arrow, but now we need to move our arrow towards our enemy. So we need to call projectile again, dot transform, and now we want to change the position of it. But we want to use local position, and the local position is actually the position of the projectile's position. Not like a global position. And actually, now that I started saying this, we should be using local position for all of these. Yeah, so we want to be using local position for all of the positions that we've just written. So up in target enemy, let's just make sure we put local. And that is just, yeah, the location in reference to that game object. And we can do it down here under get target. Basically, any place where we already wrote position, let's just go ahead and use local position. And we wrote position in a lot of places, so I'm sorry I'm doing this to you guys. Okay, so get nearest enemy in range, get enemies in range, get target distance. Oh, we didn't use it there. And then in our update method, we used it a couple times here and then right here. Okay, so local position. It'll probably still work if you use position, but it's better practice to use the local position for when you're actually like moving an object towards a game object's position. Position, okay, so local position is position of the transform relative to the parent transform. Okay, that makes sense. And then position is of the transform in the world space. So yeah, we want local. Okay, so now that that's done, let's go ahead and let's see, we need to transform our projectile. Okay, so we need to set its new local position. So now go ahead and call vector 2. And it's a nice built-in physics feature in Unity called move towards. Look at that. It's going to move it for us. And so we want the local or the current position. And now remember, we're dealing with the projectile, not the tower. So type in the projectile dot transform dot local position. All right. Comma, and then we want it to move towards the enemy. the target enemy dot transform dot local position. Okay. And then the third value is basically the speed you want the arrow to move at. And I kind of just messed around with this until I was happy. And it's I did a 5 float. And then you multiply it by time dot delta time. And that is basically just, it helps adjust the speed of the arrow. So it's the same on any different computer with a different clock speed or frame rate. And that just is kind of the built-in fix feature, okay? And then after all of that, still within the while loop, now we'll do a yield return null. And that's just to make our coroutine happy. And then outside of the while loop, so if it doesn't find an enemy or the projectile's null or the distance is too small, so it's too close, it's going to break out of that while loop, and we need to do an if statement, and we need to, if the projectile, I can't spell, projectile is not equal to null, we need to make it null, we need to destroy it. And also, if the target enemy is equal to null, we also need to destroy the projectile. So destroy, and then just pass in the projectile object that we were using here. All right, so this while loop is going to move the arrow all the way to our enemy, and it's going to keep updating and chase him down unless he goes out of range or dies. And then if he goes out of range or dies, we destroy the projectile, okay? Okay, so now we need to, all right, our attack method, we need to call this like a coroutine. So we just have to, in parentheses, we need to just do start coroutine and put this whole thing in parentheses. And that's just how you call a coroutine, okay? So this is going to, you know, if all of our checks pan out, it will start this while loop, and that will take care of chasing down our enemy, okay? Now we need to call our attack object or our attack method somewhere, right? And it's actually bad practice in Unity to move a game objects with physics. So we're constantly moving things in our move projectile. So you don't actually want to use update. You want to use void fixed update. And that is what you would use for moving game objects around. So now we have a problem. How are we going to know if we want to call, like if I just do attack here, it's going to call attack every single frame, and we don't want that. So we're going to need to create some sort of a Boolean that we can set to true or false if we want this on. So let's make a new variable called private bool, and we'll call it is attacking. And by default, we'll have it false, okay? So is attacking, if that is true, so now we can go ahead and put this in an if statement. So if is attacking is true, it will call attack, okay? So now we have to think about this. We need to look in our update method, and if we, let's see, where do we want this? Oh, we need to have, so if enemy is null, we need an else to this. So in our update method, do an else, and then if our attack counter, remember we're constantly decrementing it right here, right? So if our attack counter is less than or equal to 0, that means it has timed out. So whatever our time between attacks was, if attack counter hits 0, we want is attacking to be equal to true. That makes sense, right? All right, and then we also want to reset attack counter. So our attack counter needs to be set to our time between attacks. And our time between attacks is going to be adjusted by us in the inspector in our tower object, okay? All right, and then so if our attack counter isn't less than true, we need to put is attacking equals false here. All right. I think we're good. Oh, and then we also need to... Okay, so once attack is triggered, we also need is attacking to be equal to false, because we don't want this to... It would keep getting called every second. So this gets called, we make it false, and then it has to go through the update again, and it has to be set to true in order for our attack method to be called. And remember when I said that if you don't have curly braces after an if statement, as long as you have only one line, it will be inside of that if statement, okay? So I think we're ready to set up our towers to test this. So let's go ahead and go in our prefab and our towers, and let's click on our castle tower first. And we have to select all of our towers and add that tower script we just created. So go ahead and go to add component, scripts, and click on tower. And now we have to set up our time between attacks and our attack radius of this tower. So let's select each one individually. So our castle tower first, or yeah, our castle tower first is fine. And so I made this 1 second between attacks, and my attack radius is 3. And I kind of just figured out 3. I messed around with it and played around with it. And obviously you guys are free to change this. I just thought this was a good value. And these are floats. All right. And now let's do our night post. And for this one, I made the time between attacks 2, because this one's shooting the fireballs and they take off 100 health. So I figured it's a better delay. But I also gave this a longer range. I made this one 4. And then our rock tower, I made the time between attacks 1 second, and the attack radius is 2, so you can't throw a rock that far. All right, so should we test this? I think we should. Oh, let's make this full screen. All right, so I'm going to place a tower here. Oh, and it crashed right off the bat. All right, we have to... What did we do wrong? Let's make sure our projectiles are set. That has an arrow, fireball, a rock. All right, let's just see here. Are you gonna let me click on it? All right, guys, so I figured out what we did, and let's just go back to our code. So this if statement was outside of this else statement. Yeah, this one. Sorry guys, 1 second. I have an extra bracket now. All right, so we had our if statement that I just cut and copied right here, and we're referencing the target enemy, right? And if the enemy is null, this could still be called. So we need it in this else statement, and the enemy can't be null if this else is being called. So go ahead and cut that and put it above inside this else statement in our update method, right like that. All right. Sorry about that. So yeah, it needs to be inside this else statement. All right. And then I also noticed one more thing when we create our projectile. In the attack, we're not setting the position of the projectile anywhere. So that would also create another crash. So new projectile, projectile.transform.local position. So all we're doing is we have to set the original spot. So where do we want it to be created, right? And that is going to be, I think we could just do transform.local position, and that's going to set the position equal to our tower's position. So let's go ahead and save it and try it. Let's try this out. What's going on, Unity? There we go. All right, so let's try placing an object, and it crashes. All right, so, oh guys, silly us. So we're getting null when it's trying to fire a projectile. And I just realized we forgot to make our projectile a serialized field, because we have to set what we want it to fire. Like each tower fires a different projectile, right? Oh man, I am losing it. So make sure you serialize your projectile of type projectile, your game object projectile, serialize field that, and then save it. And let's go back over to our prefabs. So in your prefab folder, click on towers, and then castle tower, you'll now have a projectile box, right? So go ahead and go to your projectile folder in your prefabs. And let's see, this is our castle tower. So drag the arrow game object into that. All right. And then go back to your towers, go to your knight tower, and then back to projectiles, and put fireball in that projectile game object. Go back to tower and rock tower. Go back to projectiles and drag the rock into it. Oh my goodness, that was way worse than it needed to be. I'll maximize this and let's test this out. Now let's cross our fingers and hope it works. Look at that. Our arrows are flying. The game object didn't destroy itself, and it only shot once. And there, okay. We shot something. That is worth it, right? So what we need to do is basically we need to, and this will be the next video, when the projectile hits our enemy, it needs to destroy itself. And so we will get into that. We did get a projectile to fire, and I know this video has gone on pretty long. We will get this all ironed out in the next video, and it's cool. We shot an arrow, so I'm not sure why we only shot one. We will fix everything in the next video though, so I will see you guys in a little bit.